Hey, 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 how's it going, Coach Val?
Hello, Dr. Tiff. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday to you as well. It's our favorite day of the week. If you're joining us live or catching the replay, we are grateful to have you here. If you're catching us live, go ahead and share this episode. Tell somebody else to watch. Bring a friend because we're gonna have a great discussion tonight about an article from the Wall Street Journal, and it's very similar if you've heard of that term, the summer slide, which is a dip in learning after the summer break in kids. So you have kids, they learn all this great stuff during the school year. Summer happens, they may or may not do academic style learning at home. They come back to school, and the first, what would you say, Val? Couple of weeks, a month?
Like 3 to 4 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, is basically reteaching where they left off at the end of the school year. So some refer to that as the summer slide. This article we're going to talk about today from the Wall Street Journal is talking about the post COVID slide. So we all know that COVID was a real humdinger, very much
Whew.
a dent in a lot of plans. I know for myself, my kid did kindergarten during COVID, which is one of the most pivotal points in a child's career. Is that's the foundation for a lot of things they're going to learn as they get older. And learning at home in that traditional way is not the same or as effective as being in the school building learning in that traditional way. Because I am not a teacher. I was working at the time. He spent time online with his teacher, time with learning on his own, and we just made the best of it. What about your kids? Where were they at during COVID?
So the youngest was still at a daycare facility. Um, so that didn't really mess up a whole lot except inconsistency in leaving the house in the morning for him. Um, he loved it, child. We had so much outside time. It was amazing for him. Okay. The oldest one, my now freshman in high school, was in fourth grade at the time. And um, we had dabbled with him before with like doing some online learning. I was trying to get him into coding when coding was, really picking up steam. And so he had an experience with that. So it wasn't as big of a transition for him, but it was easier for us because as an educator, I was home too. So I didn't have any other job to be working while the kids were at home during COVID. That definitely made it a different situation like than yours. My biggest thing about it was fourth grade, being the math person, is a pivotal time for fractions. And in math, fractions are the bane of most people's math existence. And so I was very concerned from that. I will say after COVID, I did notice a difference in my son's enthusiasm for school and just his drive for getting things done. There was a noticeable decline in that.
Yeah. I'm sure if anybody watching or listening, think back to when what grade their kid was in during COVID, you can definitely see some positives and some negatives that happened after COVID. And this article, I think before I said Wall Street Journal, is actually NPR article, but it looked at the nation's report card now 5 years past COVID and looking at this new data for reading and math. And so what the good news was from this article was that it said in math, many students have made up at least some of the academic ground that they lost during the pandemic. So that's the good news, right? The bad news is that in both reading and math, most fourth and eighth graders in 2024 are still performing below pre-pandemic 2019 levels. So if your kids in fourth or eighth grade, they took all this aggregated data from standardized test scores across the nation. And it showed that in both reading and math, fourth and eighth graders are still performing below pre-pandemic 2019 levels. So they're performing lower than they were before the pandemic happened in those two academic areas. I know for myself, having a current fourth grader, like I said, he did kindergarten during COVID. So that makes sense to me. I'm living it. I am definitely living it. How did you feel once you read through this article as we were discussing it? Was it shocking?
So it it wasn't as shocking to me. But people got to remember, I'm a little different. Like I'm made up a little different. It takes a lot to like put me on the extremes of any type of emotion. I would definitely say it was concerning. Because I want people to understand, like Dr. Tiffany, you just told them that students have made up some of the academic ground that they've lost. What it's not saying is that they've recovered all of it. And you got to understand that when COVID happened, like if they're going on this level, there was a dip. And so here's the level pre-COVID, and there was a dip from that. So once you get to the lowest point, coming up means you're making some ground. That's that good news part, that they're coming up, but they're still not where they were. They're still lower. And I mean, yeah, that's concerning. We have kids who are graduating now who, they were in 8th grade, 9th grade in those COVID years, and we're sending them into the workforce. And they haven't gained those grounds back. So it's concerning. It was concerning to me how much they spent in education. Like the article said that the public schools have spent $190 billion in federal emergency funding that Congress gave them for this. So a lot of schools use that funding in different ways. I was a recipient of some of that, as I spent a year being a math interventionist. That was a created position in the school with COVID funds. But we're still not where we need to be.
I think if you had a kindergartner or a fourth grader during COVID, you want to listen to this episode. You want to share it with other friends who had kindergartners or fourth graders during COVID, because this is directly impacting you. And so, to Val's point about positions that were created, we know the government poured a lot of money into the public school system for there to be coaches, interventionists, specialists, mental health services. All this money, the article talked about the $190 billion, billion with a B, $190 billion that the federal government gave in emergency funding to schools across the country. And again, it was used in a way that schools felt could best benefit their students. So creating positions, giving summer school to kids over the summer, tutoring after school, all these things that they felt like once the kids were back in school after COVID, these things would help them catch up. And this article, I mean, just to say it plainly, is saying that was a failure. It didn't do what it was tagged to do, generally speaking, across the country. And so then it led me to think, well, what was done with this $190 billion? Because you and I have both worked in the public school system, and we know how you get the money in the school systems, and you get these people who sell curriculum, they sell the newest way to learn math, they sell the latest, greatest reading strategy, and these districts buy these materials in bulk for the entire district, and that's big money. These companies make big money selling their materials to school systems. So in thinking about that, it just shows that there were some gains, but we still have a long way to go. So Congress we don't have another $190 billion to give to public schools to help lower this gap, to reduce this gap. So one of the things that struck me in the articles is what the superintendents were saying, how they went about spending this money. And there was a few things that struck me. What were some things that stood out to you?
So for me, I had questions about how many people were being hired in these helpful positions. So I remember in the article, it said that there was a specialist hired and the system saw great growth and gains from the students that that specialist was involved with, right? And so my question to that though was, exactly how many students was that? Because I know as an interventionist, I could only be effective with a very small number of students as one person. And so in the grand scheme of things, does that really equal out for value of my position, like that yearly position? I don't think that there were enough people hired in those roles, honestly. I think that a lot of that money went to other places, like you said, buying curriculum and the latest, greatest thing, when we know from research that the human in the classroom is the highest indicating factor of student success. So I just question, like, there was some human resource hiring, but I just feel like there wasn't enough. Like there definitely should have been more instead of some of those other things.
Right. And we know in our school system right now across the country, there's a teacher shortage, right? Teachers are leaving the workforce in droves. We talked about that on here before. And the number of highly qualified math teachers, especially as you get up into the higher grades, the pool is very small to pull from. So not only do you need, as a math interventionist or a math specialist, do you need a small group of kids in order to be effective, the person who is in that role as the interventionist, as the specialist, needs to have a high set of skills to be able to not only catch kids up, but also teaching them new things in an expeditious manner. Because now we don't have the whole school year, right? We don't have the whole school year to play catch up. We talked about at the beginning of this episode, the summer slide. We're giving kids about 3-4 weeks to regain what they might have lost over the summer. So if you're teaching kids for an entire school year in this very structured math specialist way, the things that they might have missed the last school year, while you're doing that, you're also not teaching them the things that they need to know for the current school year that they're in. So then the gap is still there. You're moving ahead, but the gap is still there. So you're teaching them these skills in a faster paced way because you have the current school year curricula to get to as well. So I think that's a really good question that you pose. Who was in those positions as math coach, reading specialist, math interventionist, whatever it was called? Who was the person in that role and how effective were they? What did we get for our money?
Exactly. Another thing that was in the article that we thought was interesting was about Alabama specifically, and how Alabama saw a rise in their fourth grade math scores compared to pre-pandemic. And one of the things they did was they passed this Numeracy Act. So in 2019, they were ranked about 52 among the states. But by 2022, they had jumped up to 40 after passing this act. And so basically what the act was that they targeted students K through 5, and they wanted them to be proficient in math by the end of 5th grade. And so schools have a ton of elementary school students these days. They had 80 plus students and 2 math coaches. At these schools. So again, like the ratio of one adult to number of kids that they're supposed to touch, they emphasize teaching teachers how to teach the math. So this wasn't directly tied to somebody coming in and doing like intervention work. Like this was someone coming in training the teachers on how some strategies for how to teach the math better. And they created this task force. Like, Tiffany, what do you think about this?
I thought it was interesting. First of all, it was mind blown. My mind was blown that schools that had 800 plus kids got two math coaches. Two. 800 plus kids. So we're talking about math on a lot of different levels, a whole bunch of students, and we get two math coaches. If you have 800 students, you probably got at least 4 or 5 classrooms per grade level. So you're talking about a ton of teachers that these math coaches needed to train as well. That's a lot. That's a lot of pressure to put on the teachers too. So that was one of the things that came to mind for me. But with the math task force, the way that they outlined it in the Numeracy Act in Alabama was that teachers were directed to give 60 minutes a day for math instruction. They gave formative assessments and feedback. And then they established what they called an appropriate learning environment. And I thought it was interesting. I know you taught math in schools, 60 minutes a day for math. Is that pretty typical?
Yes, even though I've taught upper grades, my experience with my younger kids and their schedules, somewhere around 45 to 60 minutes they've spent on math pretty much every single day.
Okay, so about 45 minutes. So they're going to get 60 minutes with this Numeracy Act. Then the formative assessments, those are ongoing activities that help teachers and students understand how well learning is going on. So these periodic checks throughout the school year to see how they're doing. And then the teachers were giving the students feedback on how they were doing as well. It didn't really go into detail about what appropriate learning environment meant. I'm going to assume that meant, a nice, quiet, structured space for learning to take place. So I thought, that all sounds really good. A lot of times with these acts that impact education, they sound really good on paper, but how they are executed in the building looks very different from building to building as well. But they had the numbers to back it up. Like you said, in 2019, they were ranked 52nd, and in 2020, they were ranked 40th. That's a big jump in a small amount of time. So perhaps some other states could take a page from their Numeracy Act and start to implement it, because that type of improvement is pretty astonishing. I want to know also how it was sustained once the things that were put into place phased out.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive to me as well. And I mean, I did have one other thought that was like, well, did the other states just do worse? And that's it just worked out. But no, one of the things in education that teachers are taught is very effective is formative assessment with feedback. And so there's a lot of formative assessment happening, but the feedback part is the key to make it as effective as it needs to be. And with the appropriate learning environment, my assumption is that not only do we have like some control, some quiet for things to be happening, learning to take place, but I feel like there also has to be a sense of safety in the room so that kids understand it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to take risks, it's okay to try, especially for math. That's a huge part of learning in math. So I'm hoping that that's part of that appropriate learning environment as well. At one point the article talked about math scores peaking in 2013, and then they kind of dipped, not a whole lot, but they dipped, and at some points they were even stagnant. And what was interesting is that like the researchers didn't know why there was a peak. So, I mean, you and I talked and discussed it a little bit, but we couldn't even really think of like what was happening in 2013 for this peak to happen, and then they start dropping again.
Yeah, nothing major. When we did our research, nothing major happened in 2013 or coming up to 2013 that would have maybe given us an idea of why student achievement peaked in math at that point, which I think is really interesting. But I think it's very poignant that they are looking at fourth and eighth graders. That keeps coming back to my mind. We've talked about that being kind of that point where by fourth grade, it's kind of showing what you might have missed in kindergarten and first grade. It starts to show, especially in math, especially in reading. By fourth grade, you're not just reading to read. Now we're reading to learn, right? Like we're reading for deeper comprehension, deeper meaning, and then the math is at a whole new level. Like you mentioned, fractions come into play, and then they're looking again at eighth graders, what you mentioned at the top of the episode, is where you kind of seeing how well did all those higher math skills in fourth grade, how are they being built, how well are they being built upon so that they're succeeding in eighth grade. And so I really think it's important that we pay attention to that they pick those two grade levels. Something else that we talked about, and we talked about professional development on here before. They talked about it here in the article, as well as those math coaches coming out to train the teachers. We discussed how school systems, you remember we talked about $190 billion. When we send our teachers out, school districts, to these conferences to learn new information, to learn about new math approaches, reading approaches, we don't send the whole kindergarten team to go to those. We don't send the whole fourth grade team to go to those. Typically, teachers are asked, send one of you from the grade level, and you, one person, you go to the conference, you learn everything that you can learn, and you come back and you teach your classmates, which can seem cost effective, right? Makes sense. Sending one person is going to be way cheaper than sending all 5 people on the team. But what happens when the person who was sent doesn't come back with specific enough information to be able to teach the teachers that she's being tasked with educating on what she learned over a 2 or 3 day conference? It's very interesting to me, that concept.
And this is an irritation for me because, again, I think differently, which in every school, when you have more than one person, they think differently. Every classroom is different based on that teacher and what's unique to that teacher. And so what somebody else would get from attending that conference and receiving that information is going to be different than what I get from it, because they're going to look at it from their framework of how they operate their classroom, or used to if it's the academic coach. And I'm going to be looking at it from how I operate mine. Also, when you just send one person, if you send more than one person from the team, that's an opportunity for them to collaborate together, and synergy happens and you come up with different sorry, y'all. You come up with different, better ideas, more elevated ideas versus just one person sitting there. Even if the conference is interactive, if the person representing your team, your school, is talking to some other ones, yeah, they might get ideas from them, but the other people don't know your students. And so I feel like, so because of the influx of funds, like what better time than to really invest in the people who are there, along with building them to have stronger collaboration skills, to see the whole school as being a part of what they're supposed to improve, not just their little classroom. Putting them in those environments and then putting them all together in those environments can cultivate that kind of atmosphere.
Right. And of course, send in more than one teacher, maybe even three. It contributes to the reliability and validity of what they have learned there at the conference. So if you and I went, maybe we both heard the same thing, but the third person heard something different or heard it in a different way that could really transform what we do with the information that we learn. So the more people you can send, I think you can rely on the information that they're bringing back more heavily than if you just send the one or the two people. And I know we talked about the superintendents, and those are really the people all the way at the top. They're the ones that are making a lot of these decisions or have a team around them helping them put out the decision that their team came up with. The superintendents go to a lot of conferences. They're invited to come to state conferences, regional conferences, and at these conferences, there are people there, businesses there, companies that are looking for the superintendent's attention, for their ear, to show them the latest, greatest in reading, in science, in math, the latest, greatest curriculum, the latest and greatest material that will surely help their kids learn what they need to learn and show growth. That's what every school district wants. That's how you are ranked in your state, how your kids do on these summative assessments, these end of year state assessments. So you get the superintendent's ear, they're whining and dining them. They are doing lunch and learn. They are taking them out for dinner, whatever they can do to get their ear. And the superintendent might come back with this curriculum. And I know I have worked in school districts where the teachers are just caught so off guard. Where did this curricula come from? Who said this would be good for our students? They're questioning the decision making process on how we got here. Now we're going to start a new school year and we're going to teach math a whole new way. Why are we doing this? Where did this come from? And a lot of that, goes back to the superintendents and a lot of these conferences that they go to. So I wonder, of this $190 billion, how much of that was allocated for superintendents to go out and find these new curriculum that they can come back and have their staff use to hopefully increase these scores. But I resolve to the point of the whole theme of this article is that we need to meet the needs of these students that are in the lower percentiles because something that is being done isn't working for them. Something that is being used to teach them is not teaching them what they need to know. There are gaps there that I don't think a decision at the top can be made that will specifically address one of the 800 students in this elementary school because not every kid learns the same. And so if we get this new idea, this new concept, and then we throw out everything that we were using before, I think it does a disservice to kids. And so taking what we learned from this article, looking at how fourth and eighth graders really haven't made the gains that they needed to post COVID, the question for all of us to kind of ponder is the why. What are you seeing with your kid at home that you can see growth in, that you see stagnation in, or that you see regression in? Think about this when you're interacting with them at home. Think about this as a teacher when you're interacting with them in your classroom. Come together with other parents who might see similar characteristics in their kids as far as learning styles and retaining information. As teachers, get together with your grade level to talk about any commonalities that you're seeing in ways that kids are succeeding or struggling, and take this information to the school. I want parents to feel empowered that they can go back to their school and say, I've been talking with some other parent friends, and whatever y'all are doing in math, it's not working for like 5, 6, 7 of these kids. And we need something to shift. We need another approach. And be tenacious about it. Be assertive about it. Polite, but assertive. To share your concern, the themes that you're seeing between students, between other kids, and share this information back so that if there is another injection of funds into your kid's school, they don't use it in a way that creates this blanket of curriculum that all kids have to learn the same thing the same way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. Like you said, we talked about this before. We want parents to collaborate with each other. We want parents to collaborate with the teachers. We want the students to be a part of those conversations as well. Because one thing we do know, especially since we're talking about the lower achieving students and how this article talked about that gap actually widened while there was some growth being made, the gap between the lower percentiles was bigger. And so we also have to understand that for some students in the school system, there is this school to prison pipeline that's systematically built in to them going to school every day. And we know from data that our minority students are the ones who get expelled the most, they get the most referrals, they are in trouble. It's always behavior. They're the ones who fill up these special education rooms and program. So, what Dr. Tiffany says, and I completely agree, parents talk to each other. And if there's a group of you and your student is struggling, especially if that group is a minority group and your students are the ones who are struggling, band together and go have a respectful but concerned parent conversation with your teachers and with the school to see what's going on and what could be done.
Right. And be tenacious. If they tell you, well, we're trying this, and so we're gonna see how well this impacts them. Okay, when should we see the impact? 4 weeks? Okay, and then check back in 4 weeks. There's timelines to everything that's done in education.
Yeah.
And that's how they mark growth. So then come back and check, be tenacious for sure. All right, that is our episode for tonight. We hope that you will share this episode with a friend, a colleague, and that you will join us again next week. Again, remember, you can catch us on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify as well. Just search up Tuesday Talks. And with that, we'll see you next Tuesday. Bye.